On the morning of December 20th, 1943, a young American pilot gripped the controls of a battered B-17 bomber high above northern Germany. His name was Charlie Brown, and at just 21 years old, he was flying his very first combat mission. Below him, the city of Bremen was wrapped in smoke and fire as German anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts of flak. Brown's aircraft, a heavy bomber nicknamed by its crew, carried 10 men and a full bomb load. Their target was a German fighter factory on the outskirts of the city. The mission briefing had warned them about intense resistance, but nothing could prepare a new crew for what they were about to face. Brown's bomber had been assigned to the most dangerous position in the entire formation, the exposed edge where enemy fighters attacked first. Veteran crews called it a death slot. New crews were often placed there, and Brown's crew was the newest of all. Before they could even reach the target, disaster struck. A cannon shell exploded near the nose of the aircraft, shattering the plexiglass. Freezing air rushed inside at more than 100 miles per hour. One engine died instantly. Another began to fail. The bomber slowed, and the rest of the formation pulled ahead. Within moments, they were alone. German fighters appeared almost immediately. Sleek shapes dove out of the sun, circling like predators. The attack was relentless. Cannon shells tore through the aircraft. Machine gun fire ripped into metal and flesh. Systems failed one after another: hydraulics, oxygen, electricity. Defensive guns froze in the brutal cold, leaving only a few still able to fire. One crewman was killed instantly. Others were wounded badly. Brown himself felt sharp pain as shrapnel tore into his shoulder. Blood filled the cockpit. The bomber was barely holding together. Then the oxygen ran out. At 27,000 feet, the human brain cannot function without supplemental oxygen. Brown felt his vision narrowing, his hands losing strength. Beside him, his co-pilot slipped unconscious. Brown fought to stay awake, knowing that if he lost consciousness, the aircraft would fall, and everyone aboard would die. His last clear thought was simple and terrifying. This was how it ended. Not in glory, not after many missions, but on their very first flight into combat. The bomber entered a steep, uncontrolled dive. Wind screamed past the damaged airframe as the aircraft plunged toward the earth. Any moment, the wings could tear away. But as the bomber dropped into thicker air, something unexpected happened. Brown gasped and came back to consciousness, just long enough to pull back on the controls. The aircraft leveled out barely above the treetops. Brown looked around in shock. His bomber was destroyed, his crew was broken, and he had just flown directly over a German fighter airfield. On that airfield, a German pilot was preparing his own aircraft for another mission. And in a few minutes, their lives would collide in a way neither man could ever forget. The German fighter pilot watched the damaged American bomber stagger across the sky at barely treetop height. Its engines coughed unevenly, one already dead, others trailing smoke. From the ground, it looked less like a combat aircraft, and more like a wounded animal struggling to stay airborne. The pilot's name was Franz Stigler. At 28 years old, Stigler was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. He had flown hundreds of missions. He had been shot down more than a dozen times and survived every one. He had lost friends, comrades, and even his own brother to the war. That loss sat with him every time he climbed into a cockpit. On this day, Stigler had already destroyed 2 American bombers. One more kill would earn him the Knight's Cross. one of Germany's highest military honors. It would be recognition not just of skill, but of sacrifice. It would mean his family's name had not suffered in vain. When the alert sounded, Stigler ran for his fighter. The engine roared to life, and within minutes he was airborne, climbing fast. Ahead of him, the American bomber crawled forward, completely exposed. It was the easiest target a fighter pilot could ever hope for. Stigler closed in from behind, sliding into perfect firing position. His guns were armed. His finger rested on the trigger. One short burst would tear the bomber apart. No evasive maneuvers, no return fire, no risk. As he drew closer, something felt wrong. The tail section of the bomber was shredded. Through gaping holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see straight inside. He saw a gun position destroyed completely. He saw a body slumped forward, unmoving, frozen blood trailing in the slipstream. The man was clearly dead. Stigler moved alongside the bomber and looked deeper inside. He saw wounded crewmen struggling to help one another. He saw blood-soaked flight suits. He saw men who were no longer fighting, only surviving. This was not combat. These men could not defend themselves. Their guns were silent. Their aircraft was barely flying. Shooting them down now would not be a victory. It would be an execution. In that moment, Stigler remembered words spoken years earlier by his former commander, a man who believed that even war had limits. A fighter pilot's honor, he had said, was not measured by how many enemies he killed, but by how he fought. Shooting a helpless man was not bravery. It was murder. Stigler felt the weight of that lesson pressed down on him. He also felt the rosary in his flight jacket, a reminder of the faith his mother had hoped he would carry into the priesthood. He had chosen the sky instead, but not to become a butcher. He pulled his finger away from the trigger. The American pilot inside the bomber saw the German fighter slide up beside him. He was certain this was the end. He expected gunfire at any second. He waited for it. It never came. Instead, the German pilot raised his hand and gestured downward, trying to communicate. Land. Surrender. It was the only way the crew could survive. But the American did not understand. He shook his head and kept flying. Stigler tried again, pointing toward the north, toward neutral territory, toward a chance at life. Still no understanding. The bomber continued west, deeper into danger. Stigler realized something chilling. Sparing them was not enough. If he left now, someone else would kill them. Anti-aircraft guns, fighters. The war would finish what he refused to do. The German pilot faced a choice more dangerous than pulling the trigger. If he stayed with the bomber, if he helped it escape, he would be committing treason. In Nazi Germany, that crime carried a single punishment: death. Stigler did not hesitate. He eased his fighter into close formation beside the American bomber, so close that their wings were only feet apart. From the ground, they would appear as one shape. Any gunner who fired would risk hitting a German aircraft. It was a gamble with his life, and Stigler took it. Inside the shattered bomber, Charlie Brown could not understand what was happening. The German fighter remained beside them, steady and silent, its nose pointed forward instead of at their tail. Brown had ordered what guns still worked to track the enemy, but not to fire. Something about the Germans' behavior felt different. This was not an attack. This was something else. Minute after minute passed, and the fighter did not leave. Below them, northern Germany rolled past, fields, roads, villages, rail lines filled with military traffic. At any moment, anti-aircraft batteries could open fire. At any moment, another German fighter could appear and demand to know why an enemy bomber was still flying. Brown expected disaster with every second that ticked by. Franz Stigler understood the risk just as clearly. From his cockpit, he could see German positions sliding beneath them. He knew the Atlantic Wall was ahead, one of the most heavily defended coastlines in Europe. Radar stations, coastal flak guns, observer posts. Any unidentified aircraft approaching the North Sea was normally destroyed without hesitation. Stigler tightened his formation, flying even closer to the bomber. His plan was simple and desperate: force German gunners to hesitate. If they fired at the American, they would almost certainly hit him as well. And if they saw a German fighter escorting a bomber, they might assume it was a captured aircraft on a test or transfer flight. It was a lie balanced on a razor's edge. Inside the bomber, the crew watched the German aircraft hold position. Some expected a trick. Others expected the fighter to peel away at the last moment and let the guns finish them. Brown himself had no explanation. His bomber was still barely flying. Engines surged and faded unpredictably. Controls felt loose and unresponsive. The cold was brutal. Blood froze on metal surfaces. Wounded men groaned softly in the darkness of the fuselage. They crossed the coastline. Nothing happened. No flak bursts. No gunfire. No alarms. The gamble worked. The gray waters of the North Sea stretched ahead, vast and unforgiving. 250 miles of freezing ocean lay between the bomber and England. If the aircraft went down out here, survival would be measured in minutes. Stigler stayed with them to the very edge of his fuel range. His radiator was still damaged, the engine running hot. He could not follow them any farther. If he did, he would either crash into the sea or be forced to land in Britain as a prisoner of war. He slid his fighter closer to the bomber's cockpit one last time. Brown looked over through shattered glass and saw the German pilot clearly now. Not a faceless enemy. A man. Their eyes met for a brief, impossible moment. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Stigler raised his hand to his helmet and gave a formal salute. Then he banked away. The German fighter peeled off and disappeared back toward the continent, leaving the American bomber alone over the North Sea. Brown watched until the aircraft vanished into cloud and distance. He did not know the pilot's name. He did not know why he had been spared. He only knew that a man who had every reason to kill him had chosen not to. But the ordeal was far from over. The bomber limped onward, barely holding altitude. 3 engines were damaged. 1 was dead. Hydraulic systems were gone, radios were barely functional, oxygen was exhausted. 1 crewman was dead. Several more were badly wounded. Morphine syringes had frozen solid in the extreme cold, useless for pain or shock. Brown did the math again and again in his head. Airspeed was dangerously low. If it dropped any further, the bomber would stall and fall into the sea. He pushed the throttles carefully, coaxing every possible ounce of power from failing engines. Below them, the water churned dark and cold. England was still far away, and the bomber was running out of strength. The North Sea showed no mercy. Gray waves rolled endlessly beneath the bomber, each one a reminder of what waited if the aircraft failed. Charlie Brown kept his eyes moving between the instruments and the horizon, fighting exhaustion and pain. His shoulder throbbed where shrapnel had torn into it, but he refused to acknowledge it. Letting go, even for a second, was not an option. Inside the fuselage, the crew battled their own private wars. Blood loss, shock, and freezing temperatures pushed their bodies toward collapse. One gunner had lost feeling in his feet as frostbite crept in. Another bled steadily from a leg wound that no one could properly treat. The radio operator worked half-blind, hands shaking, trying again and again to coax life from damaged equipment. No response ever came. The engines were their only hope, and even that hope was fragile. One engine was completely dead. Another delivered only partial power. A third surged unpredictably, threatening to fail at any moment. Only one engine still ran cleanly. Brown needed at least 2 to maintain altitude. He had barely 1.5. The bomber crept forward at dangerously low speed. Any sudden movement, any loss of lift, would send them spiraling into the sea. Brown adjusted trim, throttle, and control pressure constantly, balancing the aircraft on the edge of disaster. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Every vibration sounded like the beginning of the end. Below them, the water temperature hovered just above freezing. Brown knew the numbers. If they ditched out here, even with life jackets, survival would last no more than a few minutes before hypothermia shut their bodies down. There would be no second chances. The crew worked silently, each man aware that panic would only make things worse. They applied pressure to wounds. They shouted updates to the cockpit. They did what they could, and waited. Then, at last, something changed. A faint line appeared on the horizon. At first, Brown thought it was another hallucination brought on by exhaustion. He blinked, forced himself to focus. The line remained. Land. England. Brown felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly broke his concentration. He forced it down. Seeing land meant nothing if he could not get the bomber safely onto it. The aircraft was in no condition to reach its assigned base. He would have to land wherever he could. Hydraulics were gone. That meant the landing gear might not extend fully. Flaps might not respond. Steering on the ground would be nearly impossible. Whatever landing he attempted would be violent. He spotted a Royal Air Force airfield ahead and lined up carefully, descending with agonizing slowness. The crew braced themselves. The landing gear dropped partially. The flaps moved just enough to matter. Brown brought the bomber down in a controlled crash, sparks flying as metal tore away beneath them. The aircraft skidded across the runway, screaming in protest, before finally grinding to a halt. For a moment, no one moved. Brown sat frozen in the cockpit, hands locked on the controls, heart pounding. Then the realization hit him all at once. They were alive. 8 men climbed out under their own power. One was carried. One had not survived the mission at all. The bomber itself would never fly again. Later, during debriefing, Brown told intelligence officers everything: the damaged aircraft, the German fighter, the escort, the salute. The officers listened without interruption. When he finished, they gave him a single order. He was never to speak of it again. The story was classified. Mercy from the enemy did not fit the war. Brown obeyed. Far across the sea, Franz Stigler landed his fighter in Germany and also said nothing. To speak would mean death. Both men carried the same secret, one act of humanity hidden inside a war that demanded none. And the secret would remain buried for decades. When the war ended, the world moved on, but the memory of that day never loosened its grip on either man. Charlie Brown returned home, carrying scars that no one could see. To everyone else, he was simply a bomber pilot who had survived a brutal mission. The true story of the enemy who had chosen mercy remained locked behind orders and silence. Brown finished his service, built a life, raised a family, and tried to live normally. Yet the image of the German fighter flying calmly beside his shattered bomber never left him. He replayed the moment again and again in his mind, wondering who that pilot had been, why he had spared them, and whether he had survived the war himself. For years, those questions had no answers. Franz Stigler's path after the war was no easier. Germany lay in ruins. The Air Force he had served no longer existed. Medals and victories meant nothing in a defeated nation struggling to rebuild. Stigler left Europe and eventually settled in Canada, starting over far from the skies where he had once fought. He, too, carried a memory that would not fade. Stigler never spoke about the American bomber he had escorted. Not to friends, not to family. In the Germany he left behind, admitting such an act could still bring shame, or worse. But more than fear kept him silent. Part of him wondered if the bomber had even made it home. If the crew had died anyway, then his choice might have meant nothing. Years passed, then decades. By the 1980s, Charlie Brown was an old man. The war felt distant to most people now, something studied in books rather than remembered. One day, while speaking at a gathering of military aviators, Brown finally told the story aloud. For the first time, he described the German fighter pilot who had chosen not to fire. The room fell silent. When Brown finished, something inside him shifted. Keeping the secret no longer felt right. If the German pilot was still alive, Brown needed to find him. He needed to know the truth. The search was slow and frustrating. Records were incomplete. Letters went unanswered. Archives offered nothing. Each lead ended in silence. Friends urged Brown to give up. After all, what were the odds of finding one man after more than 40 years? But Brown refused to stop. Finally, as a last attempt, he wrote a detailed account of the incident and sent it to a newsletter read by former German fighter pilots. He did not expect a response. Weeks later, a letter arrived. It was short, handwritten, and it began with words Brown never expected to read. I was the one. On the other side of the world, Franz Stigler had finally learned that the bomber had survived. The Americans had lived. His decision had mattered. After 46 years of silence, the secret was no longer carried alone. Charlie Brown read the letter again and again, scarcely believing what his eyes told him. After nearly half a century of wondering, the man who had spared his life was real. He was alive. And he had been carrying the same memory all those years. Brown did not hesitate. He found a phone number in Canada, dialed it with trembling hands, and waited. When the voice answered on the other end, the silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Brown spoke first, identifying himself. For a long moment there was no response. Then the German pilot began to cry. The two men talked for hours. They compared details only they could know: the position of the aircraft, the damage, the salute. Every memory matched. There was no doubt. The impossible story was real. They agreed to meet in person. When they finally saw each other in a hotel lobby in the United States, time seemed to collapse. Two elderly men stood face to face, separated by decades, but bound by a single moment in the sky. Neither spoke at first. Then they embraced, holding on as if afraid the other might vanish again. Those who witnessed the reunion later said it felt unreal. Former enemies, once trained to kill each other, now stood together as family. Brown introduced Stigler to his children and grandchildren, living proof of the lives that existed because one pilot had chosen mercy. Stigler listened quietly, overwhelmed. No medal he had ever earned could compare to that moment. From that day forward, they were inseparable. They traveled together, spoke at events, and shared their story with audiences who struggled to understand how such humanity could exist in the middle of war. Veterans wept openly. Young people listened in stunned silence. Stigler once wrote Brown a note explaining what that day had meant to him. He said he had lost his own brother early in the war. On December 20th, 1943, he had been given a chance to save another. He signed the note with 2 words that said everything. Your brother. Their bond was no longer symbolic. It was real. They called each other often. They spent holidays together. They laughed, argued, and remembered as family does. What had begun as a moment of mercy in combat had grown into a friendship deeper than either man had ever expected. The war had tried to make them enemies. Instead, it had made them brothers. As their story spread, it took on a life neither man had anticipated. Newspapers picked it up. Television programs asked for interviews. Military historians debated it. Yet what moved people most was not the strategy or the aircraft. It was the choice. One decision made in seconds that echoed across generations. Charlie Brown began pushing for official recognition, not for himself, but for his crew. For decades, their mission had been buried under classified reports and incomplete records. The men who had endured that flight had never received the honors their sacrifice deserved. Brown refused to let that stand. Investigations followed. Files were reopened. Testimonies were reviewed. Slowly, the truth resurfaced. The U.S. Air Force confirmed what Brown had always said. The mission, the damage, the losses, the impossible return, and the German fighter pilot, who chose mercy over victory. The decision stunned historians. The surviving crew members would receive the Silver Star for valor. Those who had died would be honored posthumously. And Charlie Brown himself would be awarded the Air Force Cross, one of the highest honors for heroism in combat. It was an unprecedented recognition for a single bomber crew. Franz Stigler stood beside Brown during the ceremonies, not as an enemy, but as a witness. He had never sought medals for himself. In fact, he had given up Germany's highest honor by refusing to fire that day. But years later, he received a different kind of recognition, the Star of Peace, awarded to soldiers who had demonstrated extraordinary humanity in war. Still, Stigler insisted he was no hero. He said he had simply refused to kill defenseless men. He had followed a code that valued life above orders. Their story reached even further. Books were written. Songs were composed. A restored B-17 was painted in the colors of Brown's aircraft and flown at air shows, carrying the memory of that day into the sky once more. New generations learned the names of 2 pilots who proved that compassion could survive even total war. To families of the crew, the story meant something deeply personal. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren stood together, knowing their existence traced back to one man who lifted his finger from the trigger. War had demanded hatred. One pilot chose mercy. And the world remembered. In the final years of their lives, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler understood something few people ever do. They knew exactly why they were still alive. They knew how fragile that reason had been. And they knew that the bond between them existed only because On one cold day in 1943, one man chose not to pull a trigger. They spent nearly 2 decades together after their reunion, time neither of them had expected to have. They visited schools, museums, and air bases. They stood side by side in front of crowds who struggled to reconcile the idea of enemies becoming family. And every time they told the story, the room fell silent at the same moment. The moment when the German fighter pilot chose mercy. As age took its toll, the pace slowed. Travel became harder. Conversations grew longer and quieter. But the bond never weakened. They spoke often, sometimes about the war, sometimes about ordinary things, family, weather, memories that had nothing to do with uniforms or aircraft. Franz Stigler passed away first. He was 92 years old. When the news reached Charlie Brown, it hit him harder than he expected. The man who had once saved his life, who had become his brother in every way that mattered, was gone. Brown grieved deeply, but he was also at peace. Stigler had lived long enough to know the truth. The bomber had made it home. The crew had lived. His decision had mattered. 8 months later, Charlie Brown followed him. The two men who had met as enemies over Germany, who had spent decades wondering about each other in silence, who had reunited and proven that compassion could outlast war, died the same year, almost as if one could not remain without the other for long. Their story did not end with them. Families gathered generations later, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, people who existed only because a German pilot had chosen humanity over duty. At reunions, Stigler had once stood in a room filled with faces and quietly realized the weight of his choice. Lives multiplied. Futures unfolded. Entire families traced their existence back to a single act of mercy. The restored bomber still flies at air shows, carrying the markings of that long-ago mission. Books continue to be read. Songs continue to be played. And every year, new people hear the story for the first time and struggle to believe it. But it is real. 2 young men met in the sky during the worst war humanity had ever known. One had every reason to kill. The other had no way to defend himself. And in that moment, war lost its power, if only briefly. Franz Stigler once wrote that Charlie Brown had become as precious to him as the brother he had lost. Charlie Brown carried those words for the rest of his life. They were no longer enemies. They were family. And their story remains a reminder that even in the darkest moments, humanity can still choose another path.